If you've ever had someone look you straight in the eye and tell you that your own driveway wasn't yours anymore, then you already know the kind of anger that settles deep in your stomach. Not loud anger, not the kind where you start yelling, but the quiet kind that makes you stop talking because you're already thinking 3 steps ahead. The funny thing is, the man blocking my truck that morning had absolutely no idea who he was talking to, and by the time he figured it out, his little kingdom had already started falling apart. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 64 years old, retired now, and these days I spend more time tending tomatoes than dealing with paperwork. That's exactly how I wanted retirement to look after spending 26 years working for Benton County's Department of Infrastructure Compliance. Most people hear a title like that and their eyes glaze over, but my job was simple. I made sure roads, easements, drainage systems, and public access stayed exactly the way the law required them to stay. I wasn't a cop. I wasn't a lawyer. I was just the guy counties called whenever somebody decided they could rewrite property law because they felt important. After retiring, my wife Karen and I wanted somewhere quiet. We found a modest brick house tucked away at the end of a small gated community outside Ashford, Tennessee. It wasn't fancy. No golf course, no clubhouse worth bragging about, no million-dollar homes pretending to be mansions. Just neat little houses, decent neighbors, and enough trees to make you forget the highway existed. The only thing that caught my attention during closing was the paved road leading through the subdivision. It was the only entrance to our property, and the realtor casually explained that our lot had permanent legal access through the neighborhood because it had existed long before the subdivision itself. I nodded, glanced over the paperwork, noticed the recorded easement, and honestly never thought about it again. Why would I? I drove that road every day for almost 8 months. Every morning I'd wave at Mrs. Collins while she walked her golden retriever. I'd stop and chat with an older veteran named Frank whenever he was outside polishing his old pickup. Sometimes neighborhood kids rode bicycles past my house, and Karen would hand out lemonade during the summer. It felt peaceful. Maybe not perfect, but peaceful enough that we finally felt like we'd found somewhere to grow old together. Then the Homeowners Association president decided he didn't like me. His name was Victor Hale, and if you've ever met the type, you already know him. Perfectly pressed polo shirt, spotless white sneakers, sunglasses resting on his forehead even when it was cloudy, and the strange confidence that only comes from spending too many years convincing people a volunteer title gives them actual authority. At first it was little things. A letter saying my trash can sat visible from the street 30 minutes too long after pickup. Then another claiming my pickup truck looked too commercial for the neighborhood. A warning because I parked my utility trailer beside my garage for exactly 1 weekend while repairing my fence. Karen laughed the first few times. "He's probably just bored," she'd say while dropping the letters into the recycling bin. I laughed too, until I realized every letter carried Victor's signature, and nobody else seemed to be getting them. One afternoon I was washing my truck when Frank wandered over holding a cup of coffee. He glanced toward Victor's house before lowering his voice. "Don't take it personally," he muttered. "Every few years he picks somebody." I looked up. "Picks somebody?" Frank shrugged. "Last year it was the Henderson family because their grandson left his basketball hoop in the driveway. Before that it was an older widow who planted flowers without asking permission. Victor likes reminding people who's in charge." I chuckled. Good thing he's not actually in charge of much. Frank looked at me for a second before saying quietly, "Just don't embarrass him in public. He doesn't forget." I should have paid more attention to that sentence. About 3 weeks later, I came outside around 7:31 Tuesday morning, carrying my toolbox. I had a small consulting job across town helping an old contractor friend inspect drainage on a commercial site. It wasn't about the money. Retirement gets boring if you don't keep your brain working once in a while. I tossed my toolbox into the truck bed and reached for the driver's door when I heard the rumble of a tow truck turning into the neighborhood. At first I assumed somebody had broken down. Then it stopped right beside my pickup. The driver climbed out carrying paperwork. "Daniel Mercer?" he asked. "Yeah. I've got authorization from the Homeowners Association to remove this vehicle." I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. "You're kidding." He handed me the paperwork. My smile disappeared. Victor's signature sat right there across the bottom. Before I could even process it, Victor himself walked across the street with both hands tucked comfortably into his pockets. "Morning, Daniel," he said with that fake friendly smile. "Association rules. Unauthorized commercial vehicles aren't permitted on private community roads. I stared at him. This truck's registered as a personal vehicle. He shrugged. Board disagrees. Then the board's wrong. He leaned in just enough for only me to hear. Around here, I decide what's wrong. I wanted to argue. Lord knows I wanted to. But something about the confidence in his voice bothered me more than the tow itself. Men only sound that certain when they think nobody can challenge them. So I let the driver hook up my truck. $268 later, plus an entire morning wasted retrieving it from the impound lot. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the violation notice, while Karen quietly placed a cup of coffee beside me. She didn't say much. She just asked one question. Are you finally going to tell him what you used to do? I looked down at the paperwork, smiled a little, and slowly shook my head. Not yet, I said. I'd rather see how far he's willing to take this first. And as it turned out, Victor Hale was just getting started. The strange thing about dealing with people who mistake confidence for competence is that they almost always overplay their hand. If Victor had stopped after towing my truck, I probably would have handled everything quietly, filed the appropriate paperwork, and moved on with my life. Instead, he kept pushing, and every time he pushed, he handed me another piece of evidence. Over the next 2 weeks, the violation letters multiplied like weeds after a spring rain. My mailbox apparently sat 2 inches too close to the curb. My driveway lights were supposedly brighter than community guidelines allowed. Someone even measured the height of the grass along my back fence after 3 straight days of thunderstorms and claimed I was neglecting my property. Karen started pinning every letter to a corkboard in the laundry room. Building quite the collection, she joked one evening. I smiled, but inside I was beginning to recognize a pattern I'd seen dozens of times during my career. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about creating a paper trail that justified whatever Victor wanted to do next. Men like him always believed enough paperwork could make fiction look official. What they never understood was that real records always outlast fake authority. The following Thursday, I attended my first HOA board meeting. Not because I expected fairness, but because I wanted to see everyone involved. The meeting room sat inside the subdivision clubhouse, a modest building with folding chairs, burnt coffee, and fluorescent lights that made everybody look 10 years older. About 30 homeowners showed up. Most kept their heads down. A few quietly nodded when I walked in. Victor stood at the front beside 3 board members, smiling as though he were hosting a television show instead of discussing neighborhood landscaping budgets. When public comments began, I calmly stood. I'd like to discuss the towing of my vehicle and repeated claims that I don't have legal access to the road leading to my home. Victor didn't even let me finish. He laughed. Actually laughed. Mr. Mercer still believes county records somehow override HOA authority. A few nervous chuckles echoed through the room. Victor, I answered evenly. County property records aren't opinions. He folded his arms. Then show us something besides stories. His tone wasn't angry. That was the dangerous part. He genuinely believed he had already won. I looked around the room and noticed something interesting. None of the other board members looked nearly as comfortable as he did. One older woman avoided eye contact completely. Another man kept flipping through the meeting packet without reading it. Their attorney, a younger woman named Rebecca Lawson, sat quietly near the wall making notes. She hadn't spoken a single word. I hadn't brought any documents that evening on purpose. Instead, I simply nodded. Fair enough, I said. I'll bring paperwork next time. Victor grinned. We'll all be waiting. As Karen and I walked back to the truck, she glanced over at me. You're smiling. Am I? That's your work smile. The one you used whenever someone filed a complaint they couldn't possibly win. I laughed. I haven't worn that smile in a few years. The next morning I drove downtown, not to the county office, but to the public records building where I'd spent more mornings than I could count before retirement. The young clerk behind the counter looked familiar. Mr. Mercer? She asked with surprise. Thought retirement would have kept you away from this place. It tried, I replied with a grin. Need to pull a few old easement files. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting at a wooden table surrounded by recorded plats, survey maps, and documents older than some of the people now running the HOA. Then I found exactly what I remembered seeing during closing, only this time I studied every page. In 1986, before the subdivision even existed, the county approved a permanent public access easement benefiting the parcel that would eventually become my property. The developer who built the neighborhood had accepted that condition in writing before laying a single foot of asphalt. The easement wasn't temporary. It wasn't conditional. It couldn't be revoked by an HOA vote, board policy, or neighborhood guideline. It ran with the land itself. As I kept reading, another detail caught my eye. Maintenance responsibility belonged to the HOA, but legal access belonged to the easement holder. In plain English, they had to maintain the road, and they couldn't stop me from using it. I leaned back in my chair and couldn't help laughing quietly to myself. Victor hadn't just been wrong. He'd been confidently wrong while putting those mistakes into writing. Before leaving, I requested certified copies of every relevant document, including historical plats, recorded surveys, easement agreements, and subdivision approval records. Then I stopped by an old surveyor friend named Mike Reynolds. We'd worked together for nearly 18 years. After catching up over coffee, I slid the documents across his desk. He scanned the first page, then the second, then looked over his reading glasses. Somebody giving you trouble? HOA president thinks he owns my access road. Mike chuckled. Well, that's going to age poorly. By the following week, I had a binder nearly 3 inches thick. Karen joked it looked heavy enough to stop a bullet. Every document was tabbed, every page highlighted, every relevant statute bookmarked. Not because I planned on overwhelming anyone, but because experience had taught me something simple. The louder someone lies, the quieter your evidence should be. Before the next board meeting, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Collins knocked on our front door carrying a pie. I figured you two could use dessert, she said with an awkward smile. We invited her inside. After a few minutes, she sighed. Victor's been telling people you're trying to sue the whole neighborhood. Karen nearly choked on her coffee. Sue everybody? Mrs. Collins nodded. Some folks are scared. I smiled gently. I'm not suing anyone. I know, she replied. That's why I'm here. She hesitated before lowering her voice. Daniel, there are people on that board who know Victor's gone too far. They just don't know how to stop him. That sentence stayed with me. Bullies rarely survive on courage alone. They survive because decent people convince themselves staying quiet is easier. The second board meeting was twice as crowded as the first. Word had spread. I carried my binder into the room without saying much and took a seat near the back. Victor noticed immediately. Looks like someone finally found Google, he joked loudly. Several people laughed again, though this time it sounded forced. When my turn came, I walked to the front, placed the binder on the table with a soft thump, and slowly opened it. You asked for paperwork, I said. Here it is. I slid the certified easement across the table first, then the recorded subdivision plat, then the county approval letter, then the developer's signed agreement acknowledging permanent public access. Victor's smile faded ever so slightly. He picked up the first document, skimmed 2 paragraphs, and frowned. This doesn't change anything. I didn't argue. I simply turned another page. Recorded June 19, 1986. Another page. Accepted by the original developer. Another page. Referenced again during subdivision approval. Rebecca Lawson, the HOA attorney, quietly leaned forward. May I see those? She asked. I handed her the binder without a word. The room suddenly became very still. She read for nearly 2 minutes while Victor kept talking, insisting HOA authority superseded old agreements. She never looked at him. Finally, she closed the binder carefully and asked one question. Mr. Hale, were you aware this easement existed before authorizing vehicle removals? Victor hesitated. Just for a second. Our governing documents, that wasn't my question. Silence. It was the first crack. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and placed one final item on the table. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. Just a worn leather credential holder that hadn't left my desk drawer in years. Rebecca glanced down, then back at me. You worked for Benton County Infrastructure Compliance. 26 years. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Retired deputy field inspector. I nodded. Specialized in access disputes, easement enforcement, and roadway compliance. Victor's face lost every bit of color. For the first time since we'd met, he stopped talking. He finally understood why I hadn't argued, why I hadn't shouted, why I'd simply kept collecting documents while he kept making mistakes. I looked directly at him and spoke as calmly as if we were discussing the weather. Victor, I've spent half my career investigating cases almost identical to this one. The only difference is, back then I was the person deciding whether violations should move forward. Today, I'm simply the property owner filing the complaint. You could almost hear the air leave the room. And at that exact moment, before anyone had time to recover from what they'd just heard, Rebecca slowly closed her notebook, turned toward the rest of the board, and said the words Victor never expected to hear. I believe this association has a very serious legal problem. Nobody said a word for several long seconds after Rebecca finished speaking. The silence felt heavier than any shouting match ever could. Victor looked around the room as if he expected someone, anyone, to jump in and rescue him. But the people who had laughed with him a few minutes earlier suddenly found the carpet incredibly interesting. I had seen that look before. It was the moment confidence finally collided with documentation. Rebecca adjusted her glasses, reopened the binder, and spoke with the calm, measured tone only attorneys seem capable of using when they know the facts aren't on their client's side. The easement is valid. It's properly recorded. It predates the subdivision, and the association accepted it as part of the original development approval. If these documents are authentic, and they certainly appear to be, the association had no legal authority to restrict access, authorize towing, or interfere with Mr. Mercer's use of this roadway. Victor finally found his voice. There has to be another interpretation. Rebecca slowly shook her head. There isn't. One of the board members, a retired school principal named Linda Foster, turned toward Victor with genuine confusion. You told us county records supported everything we were doing. Victor swallowed hard. That's what I believed. I couldn't help smiling just a little. Believing something doesn't change what's filed at the courthouse. Nobody laughed this time. The meeting ended less than 10 minutes later because there really wasn't anything left to debate. Rebecca advised the board to suspend all enforcement actions involving my property immediately and schedule an emergency executive session. As Karen and I walked back to the truck, she slipped her hand into mine and quietly said, "You know, that might have been the calmest revenge I've ever witnessed." I laughed. It wasn't revenge. She looked at me with one raised eyebrow. Really? No, I admitted with a grin. Maybe just a little. The next few weeks moved surprisingly fast. 2 county investigators visited the neighborhood to verify the easement and inspect the complaints I had officially filed after the meeting. They measured the roadway, reviewed the subdivision plats, photographed the entrance, and interviewed several residents. More than one neighbor quietly admitted they had questioned Victor's decisions for years, but never spoke up because challenging him always seemed to create more problems than it solved. That was probably the saddest part of the whole experience. Most communities aren't damaged by one difficult person. They're damaged because decent people convince themselves that staying silent is the easier choice. 28 days after that meeting, a certified envelope arrived in our mailbox. Inside was a formal letter from the HOA acknowledging that my access rights were protected by recorded county easements, rescinding every violation notice issued against my property, reimbursing the towing costs, my filing expenses, and even the consulting income I'd lost the morning my truck was taken. Another paragraph confirmed that the association had adopted new legal review procedures before any future enforcement involving property access. Karen read the letter twice before looking over at me. "Think this is the end?" I shrugged. "For us, probably." She smiled. "What about Victor?" I answered without looking up from my coffee. People eventually become accountable for the culture they create. 2 weeks later, the answer arrived on its own. Frank walked across the street carrying his usual coffee mug and wearing the biggest grin I'd ever seen on him. "Guess who resigned?" he asked before I even opened the door. I couldn't honestly pretend to be surprised. Victor had stepped down as HOA president after what the board described as a loss of confidence in his leadership. There were rumors that several homeowners had demanded an audit of previous enforcement decisions. Others wanted every questionable fine issued during his time in office reviewed by independent counsel. I never followed the details because, truthfully, I didn't need to. My goal had never been to destroy the man. I simply refused to let him rewrite the law because nobody challenged him. A few months later, I was trimming tomato plants in the backyard when a moving truck pulled into Victor's old driveway. A young family climbed out, smiling, laughing, carrying boxes into what would become their new home. Life has a funny way of moving forward without asking anyone's permission. Sometimes I think back to that first morning when Victor stood in front of my truck with his arms crossed, convinced the road belonged to him simply because he'd repeated it enough times. He wasn't an evil man. At least I don't think so. He was something far more common. Someone who spent so many years confusing authority with ownership that he forgot authority only exists as long as people are willing to believe it. The law doesn't care about confidence. It doesn't care about titles, louder voices, or bigger egos. It cares about facts, records, and the truth that's been sitting in a courthouse file long before any HOA president printed his first business card. Retirement has been wonderfully quiet ever since. Karen still teases me whenever a certified envelope shows up in the mailbox, asking if another neighborhood has accidentally declared war on the county's most stubborn retired inspector. I tell her I sincerely hope not, but if they do, I still know exactly where the courthouse keeps the records. Now I'd really like to hear what you think. Was Victor simply trying to protect his neighborhood and let his authority go too far? Or do you think he knowingly abused his position because he believed nobody would ever challenge him? Have you ever dealt with an HOA, a neighbor, or someone in power who acted like they owned something they legally didn't? Share your story down in the comments, because some of the most unbelievable situations come from real life. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around because the next one might make this HOA disaster look almost polite.